Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Yes, you read that title correctly. We have not had an Operation Core Dump episode in a while, but we got one today, and I'm pretty sure I mentioned it back during our If Blank Were a Programming Language episode that I was originally going to make that episode an Operation Core Dump episode, but then realized I was having too much fun with this concept and decided to make an entire episode out of it. But this week, we got an Operation Core Dump, a zero-day exploit vulnerability that cropped up this past week that I thought was worth mentioning, some OEM tomfoolery, and this idea of the solved problem. So that's coming up in this week's episode, but before we get into that, let's start off with our trivia question. So, what programming language is older? Python or Java? And I'll give you bonus points if you can get the years as well. And as a little bit of a hint, you're probably wrong. So again, the question for this week is, what programming language is older, Python or Java? So before we get into the cybersecurity tip, we're going to kind of roll in a little bit of cybersecurity know-how in this idea of the zero day. Now, if you've listened to the podcast for long enough, you know that I am more than happy to clown on and take shots at Google when they mess up for things like when they discover 0 days in the Chrome browser, for example. But as someone that's trying to be objective and call balls and strikes, when my go-to browser of choice on non-Apple devices falls victim to the same thing, that being a 0-day vulnerability, I feel like I have to try to bring it up. So this past week, there was a 0-day vulnerability discovered in Firefox that would allow an attacker to exploit a use after free vulnerability in Firefox's animation timelines in order to execute arbitrary code on the victim's machine. So essentially how this particular vulnerability worked is it would be triggered through malicious CSS, so JavaScript is not the bad guy in this case for once, but essentially what happened is it wasn't that CSS is bad per se. It's how Firefox was interpreting this CSS that caused the issue. So in case you weren't aware of how web browsers work, essentially what they do is they reach out to web servers with an HTTP GET request, and then when they get back all the data like the HTML, the JavaScript, the CSS, all that fun stuff, they're in charge of interpreting all of that data coming in and rendering it all in your browser. So they have to take in all that data, render any images, display any text, format things. So there's a lot of interpretation that has to go in to rendering a website that you get back from a web server. And that's all done, of course, by your web browser. Now, of course, because all of this is interpreted, there are ways that you can accidentally mess up the interpretation or not account for certain edge cases or things like that, which can cause various issues with your web browser, in this case, 0-day vulnerabilities. So the issue, of course, here is because it's written in C and C++. I think Firefox is mostly C++. And that's kind of where the issue is because, of course, say it with me, C and C++ are not memory-safe languages. And if that's the first you're hearing about this, well, there are plenty other episodes on this podcast where we discuss what memory safety is and specifically how it relates to C and C++ in much further detail. So I'm not going to go super in depth to all of that. But I guess what I do want to touch on here is kind of as a quick side note. There may be something to be said about those developers whose personal websites you look at and you can just tell immediately by looking at the website that they don't give two you-know-whats about it at all, because it's literally just raw HTML. So if you try to resize the page or try to view it on like a mobile device, it just looks like absolute dog water. It just looks horrible because they don't care and it's just raw HTML. But maybe there's something to be said about those websites, because rarely do you see HTML causing zero-day vulnerabilities or some other malicious activity like so often is found with things like JavaScript, and in this case, CSS not being interpreted correctly and thus causing a 0-day. But the other thing too about that is I think of course, this is a very broad generalization, so it doesn't fit everyone perfectly, of course. But usually those devs that have the absolute garbage websites that's literally just, straight raw HTML that looks like it's straight out of the 90s, those are generally the devs that are the absolute wizards. But kind of tangent aside, getting back to the vulnerability here, I think it's worth kind of recapping what a use after free vulnerability actually is. So, of course, in languages like C and C++, where you have to allocate your memory, you also need to free your memory, assuming, of course, you are a good programmer and you don't want to have a bunch of memory leaks, which I'll touch on this a little bit later in the episode, but I found a hilarious meme this week about memory leaks, which actually I'll just get into it right now because it's absolutely hilarious. So, do you know the Phil Swift Flexio meme where he has like flex tape and there's like a leak of big huge leak coming out of this pipe or whatever, and he just like slaps the flex tape on it to fix it, and it's kind of a meme. So the meme is Phil Swift is the dev. The water leaking, of course, is the memory leak, and the flex tape that he's slapping on there is a reboot. And it's funny because a reboot definitely fixes the issue of the leak, if you will, because it then frees all the memory. But of course, that's just a temporary solution because that doesn't actually fix the root of the problem, that being the big gaping hole in the program. Now, I think flex tape is probably a stronger and more permanent solution than a reboot, mainly because a reboot literally doesn't do anything as far as fixing the root of the issue. But anyway, I just thought that was a hilarious meme. Anyway, getting back into use after freeze and whatnot. So in C and C++, you of course have to allocate memory when you want to, do things yet when you want to request memory from the operating system. And of course, more in modern languages, all this is handled for you behind the scenes, so you don't really have to worry about it. But assuming you want to be a good programmer and don't want to have memory leaks, you are supposed to free your memory before it goes out of scope, or have some kind of destructor in the case of C++ that will free that memory for you when it goes out of scope. And as a quick recap on what scope is in this programming context, scope is essentially just another way of saying the lifetime of a variable. So for instance, the variable's scope could be the duration of a function, it could be the duration of a loop, an if statement, or it could be the entire life of a program. So for instance, if you have an if statement, for example, and inside that if statements, in this case, since we're doing C and C++, inside those curly brackets, you create a variable. The scope or the lifetime of that variable only exists within that if statement. Once you exit out of that if statement, that variable essentially goes away. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about scope. So if you're allocating memory within that scope and you don't then pass off that pointer to that memory through some other variable, you have to free the memory. Otherwise, you're going to have a memory leak because you have allocated memory with a pointer that no longer exists. So you can no longer access that allocated memory, and it is thus leaked because it can no longer be freed unless you reboot the system or your program terminates. So that's kind of a quick recap on scope. So now how that relates to use after free vulnerabilities. So while you can be a good programmer and free your memory, there is still a chance that you could try to access that memory even though you've already freed it, and that is where the issue comes into play. So if you've freed that pointer, which points to memory that you allocated, but you didn't clear it, or you set it equal to null, or you changed it to then now point to something else, a new valid value, and you try to call that pointer again, that pointer is still pointing to valid memory, and that memory is still active. So there is a chance that depending on how fancy the attacker is and how they manipulate different data through the flow of your program, they can essentially inject arbitrary code into that memory address that's the pointer's pointed to, and then when that pointer gets called upon again, it will then execute that arbitrary code, and thus you get your arbitrary code execution, or in this case with a remote attacker, remote code execution, which is basically the worst kind of vulnerability that you can have. Now, if we look at an example here, so if we assume that the pointer is still in scope, or I guess I should rather rephrase that. When a pointer is still in scope, from the program's perspective, it still has that same type. So if you create an integer pointer, for example, and you allocate memory to it, through the duration and life of that pointer, your program and your operating system is going to assume that that variable is an integer pointer. It's pointing to an integer. So the same thing happens if you have a structure or a function pointer or a class or anything like that. Anything that's a pointer, the program and thus the operating system is going to assume that it is of that type during its and throughout its entire lifespan, because this isn't a language like Python where you can arbitrarily change the type of the variable throughout the runtime. So because of that, because the program still assumes the pointer is still of the same type, it means all of the same variables, values, offsets, etc. still exist in the same spots for that given variable or structure or class or whatever. So if you, say, have a structure that has a function pointer as its variable, and then you then call upon that pointer's function pointer to run later, if you freed that memory, that function pointer is still pointing to something. So and that pointer is still pointing to something. So if you can overwrite the memory in there, you can and call upon that pointer, you can essentially have it pointing to and calling a function that then points to something else that the attacker specified, and thus run the attacker's code, and thus you have a use after free vulnerability. So it's really important that when you free memory and there's a chance that, for example, if that pointer runs throughout the life of your program, or it's running within a loop, for instance, like a while loop or something, it's paramount that you either clear that variable out, like setting it to null, for instance, or you set it back to a new valid value after you free the memory. So that's just kind of a quick recap on what a use after free is and kind of how it relates to the Firefox 0 day. Now, as I guess a quick update here, if you're running version 131.0.2 or you're running the ESR release 128.3.1 or later, you're good, and you don't have to worry about this vulnerability anymore. So yeah, 0-day in Firefox, so definitely be sure to update your browser if you are running Firefox, or if you're running like the Tor browser or some other browser that uses Firefox. Definitely make sure that you are updating your browser. And with that, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. Now, this week's cybersecurity tip, just like you want to make sure you're not using your variables after you free them, you also want to make sure you aren't using accounts after the owners of said accounts no longer exist. That was a very poor way of wording that and a horrendous segue. But what I was trying to essentially get at is you want to be auditing your user accounts to make sure that there aren't any user accounts for either inactive users or users that have since left your company, organization, or whatever, or just in general don't need access anymore, since the only users on a system should be active users, which is typically why you'll see in like enterprises, for instance, if you don't use your account within a set time window, your account will most likely be deactivated, and then within an additional time window, if you still don't log into your account again, your account will be deleted. And this is essentially for this exact purpose, but to try to automate it, if you will. But even if you do have this kind of rolling practice, it's still good to audit your user accounts in general, just because there is, of course, the potential that you could have an employee that got let go, but they had recently just logged into their account, and their account is still technically going to be valid unless you remove it until whatever that grace period is, whether that's 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, or whatever you have it set to. So you want to be periodically auditing your user accounts just to make sure that only users that are active users of the system have accounts and they're actively using it, because this of course comes back to this idea of the principle of least privilege. So all users also should only have the level of privilege that they actually need to have. So if you have someone that literally just needs to have access to a folder to be able to, view documents and stuff, they don't need to make any changes, there's no point in giving them write permissions to anything in that folder. Similarly, if they just need access to a system, there's no reason to give them admin privileges to be able to do whatever they want on there. So kind of, going back to that principle of least privilege as well. But also, in addition to, ensuring that only users that actually use the system have accounts, the other reason why it's important is because inactive users are essentially sitting ducks for someone that wants to try to come along and gain unauthorized access to your system. Because whether it's, an old account that hasn't really been used, or maybe it's an old disgruntled employee perhaps, if the account credentials get leaked somehow and get picked up by a threat actor, since that account is still technically active, the threat actor or potentially the disgruntled employee could use those credentials to log into your system, which is another reason why you want to be sure that you're auditing your user accounts regularly to ensure that you don't have these kind of stale accounts, if you will, which is also potentially another reason why organizations tend to push for, changing your password every X number of days, because in cases like this, where say there was a breach somehow, if a threat actor somehow managed to get hold of your company's account's credentials or something through some kind of data breach, and they tried to log in, they'd have to kind of get you within that certain window. Otherwise, you would have changed your password at that point, and they would no longer be able to have access to it. But the other thing, I guess, when it comes to passwords in this case is it doesn't even have to be from your company's, like a data breach from your company. Because as sad as it is, there are a lot of people that reuse passwords. And I know this for a fact because there was a time where I reused a good number of passwords. I've gotten a lot better at that because I've adopted a password manager. If you haven't heard the news, it was kind of a thing a while ago where I was talking about self-hosting my own Bitwarden instance. I still do. So I self-host my own password manager and have all my passwords saved locally on hardware I own in my home lab. So it's fantastic. So I definitely recommend that if you don't have a password manager, you get one, because it makes, managing all your passwords a lot easier and creating strong and unique passwords a lot easier, so you don't necessarily have to remember them or anything like that. And if you have a good password manager, all that data will be encrypted, so only you will be able to have access to it. So definitely something I'd recommend you do and get if you don't have. But that's still to say that some people still reuse passwords. And what hackers will tend to do is they'll buy, data from the dark web or whatever from a data breach, and they'll comb through all that data and try to find usernames and passwords. And because they know people reuse usernames and reuse passwords all the time, usually because your username is just your email address, so they can get the email address and use that all across the web, and then they can just copy that password that they find and paste it all around and try to log into your accounts. And that's typically how these accounts work, how these attacks work. They get a leak of data from something, whether that was, maybe there was a data breach from Discord, or there was a data breach from YouTube or something like that. They'll download, that all that data, and they'll sift through all the usernames and passwords. And typically they won't be able to get the passwords, because if the developers of the database were intelligent, they would encrypt the passwords or hash the passwords or have some way of obfuscating the passwords so they're not in plain text. The issue, of course, here is there are things called rainbow tables. We've talked about this on the podcast before. Essentially, a rainbow table is a pre-computed table of hashes and their associated passwords. So even if you don't actually have the plain text password, if you have a rainbow table of hashes, you can compare those hashes against the password hashes in the database, and then you can be able to correlate that to what the actual password is. And thus, you get the password for the account. So that's generally how these kind of things go. And then, of course, once the threat actor can get the username and password, they can go trying that around on all the different sites. And if you have inactive employees or accounts that are, haven't updated their credentials in a while, that's how a threat actor can get in and kind of abuse that. So, yeah, kind of a couple different cybersecurity tips in there, kind of all rolled into one. But that is your tip for the week. Be sure you're auditing your user accounts. And before we get into the nerdy stuff I got up to this week, we already touched on that meme, but Apple kind of came out of nowhere with their iPad mini release, which I guess it's not really out of nowhere, since everyone's been kind of expecting it for a while. There were some potential rumors that it was going to come out during the iPhone event back in September. That, of course, didn't happen. And then the rumors were kind of switching to it'll be at the October event when they unveil the new Macs. That, of course, didn't happen either. It just kind of got a press release. But also, this was essentially, I think, basically 2 years in the making, so definitely been a while. So kind of to go over the new features real quickly, it's mainly just a spec bump. The jelly scrolling issue is allegedly fixed, and if you're not familiar with what that is or what that means, on the 6th generation iPad mini or the previous one, users were encountering a issue where when they would scroll on the device, the scrolling wasn't even, because I don't know if it was how they had the panel oriented or the panel they were using or what it was, but essentially if you scrolled, the left side would kind of either be ahead or lag behind the right side, so you would kind of get this jelly scrolling effect, if you will, where the the screen wasn't refreshing at, like, I guess the appropriate rate on each half of the screen, and kind of causing this, weird deformity, when you were scrolling. I'm pretty sure there's also, like, I think there's some kind of legal action, something going on, like a class action lawsuit or something going on. It's kind of a whole deal. But anyway, supposedly that has been fixed. The A17 Pro is now the chip powering the iPad mini, so it will get all the fancy schmancy new Apple Intelligence features when they finally decide to roll out. In case you are wondering, the older iPad mini, the one that this one's replacing, had the A15 chip, so a couple years old. They also bumped up the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth support to Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.3, if that matters to you. The Apple Pencil support now is for the Apple Pencil Pro and the USB-C Apple Pencil. It now starts storage-wise at 128 gigabytes, which is a nice spec bump from the previous starting, which was only 64. And it also has 3 storage tiers rather than just 2. So on the previous iPad mini, you could either get 64, which was the base, or 256. Now on this new one, you can either get 128, which is the base, 256, or 512. So definitely some nice options there. And the last thing that I kind of noticed from the update is the USB-C port on the iPad mini now supports 10 gigabits per second, thanks to the A17 Pro, which is a bump up from the previous one, which was just 5 gigabits per second. So nice little spec bump there. And I mean, it has been 2 years, so it is kind of nice to see. It's kind of about time. But the other nice thing, too, is you get all these, nice new spec bump features, and it's the same price as before, so $4.99. And you, of course, can order it now. So that was the quick iPad mini update. And with that, let's move into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So, do you guys remember the not-so-nice things Linus Torvalds had to say about NVIDIA? Because I also had some not-so-nice words to say, not about NVIDIA, but about OEM desktop manufacturers, specifically HP. Now, of course, this is a family-friendly show, so I'm going to keep it very family-friendly. But I was reminded this week why I typically don't buy HP servers. Now, I didn't buy an HP server, but remember last week when I talked about setting up my home theater PC. So that PC was an HP mini PC, and I noticed when I got it, it didn't have a Wi-Fi card installed, which was a little unfortunate. But, I mean, it had all the antennas in place, so it wasn't that big of a deal. I could just find a cheap one. I think they were going on eBay for like $5 or something like that. So, I mean, it wasn't a huge deal. And in the meantime, I had a USB Wi-Fi dongle that I was using, so it wasn't that big of a deal. So as I mentioned, I ordered this Wi-Fi card and went to install it, and wouldn't you know it, the system wouldn't even post. It wasn't that, the system powered on and the Wi-Fi didn't work. It just simply wouldn't post. It would turn on, the light would come on the front, and the fan would spin, but it wouldn't post. Nothing, nada, zilch, no beeps, no nothing. It would not post at all. So and here is the funny thing, because when I went to install the card, I thought to myself, maybe I should try plugging everything in before I button everything up and, tighten all the screws and everything. And I was like, nah, it'll work fine. I'm just installing the card into the slot. I plugged everything in. It'll be fine. And then, of course, it didn't work. So after doing some researching and troubleshooting, apparently HP decided it was a great idea to lock down the BIOS and essentially whitelist devices, so non-HP deemed worthy devices will cause the system to fail to post. Like, really, HP? Really? Now, before you ask, the card I bought was indeed the same model that came with this HP if you bought it from HP themselves, which was the Intel 9560 Wi-Fi card. And so it was the same Wi-Fi card that shipped with those machines. So it's not like I was using some card that, was never supported by HP. It was literally the same card that HP shipped in their mini PCs that came with Wi-Fi enabled. So I was under the assumption, like I think many normal human beings would be, that if you bought hardware that was supported by the platform, it should work, right? So it's also my understanding that from reading through various forum posts and trying to research and troubleshoot this issue, that HP essentially bakes into either the firmware or the BIOS or something what's known as a feature flag, which essentially tells the platform what capabilities are supported and what capabilities aren't. So to me, this just kind of screams what BMW did not too long ago, where they came out with cars that, like, I think it was either a heated seats or heated steering wheels or both. I don't know, but essentially they shipped all these cars that came stock with those features, but if you wanted to use them, you couldn't unless you paid a subscription for it. So in the same case here, yes, all of the HP mini PCs had the capability to use Wi-Fi, but apparently, I guess, if you didn't buy it from HP from the factory with Wi-Fi, you could never put Wi-Fi in later, even though it has the ports and the antennas to be able to work. So, not entirely sure what's going on there. The other thing that I also found out too was perhaps the issue was the fact that the Wi-Fi card I got wasn't blessed with an HP certified firmware key or some other nonsense like that they use in order to allow the system to boot. Like, I'm guessing what probably happened is HP didn't give this card that I bought a firmware, a key, or whatever. So when the BIOS tried to do the handshake with the Wi-Fi card to essentially discover what it is, it didn't give it the right answer. So it's like, I'm not going to play with you anymore. I am not going to do this. I am just going to take my toys and go home. And basically wouldn't play nice in the sandbox. Now, thankfully, as I mentioned, I only paid like $5 for this thing, and that included tax and shipping. So it really wasn't a huge loss. I mean, I didn't. It's not necessarily like it was, a couple $100, and it's kind of a big oof. But so I went back to using the Wi-Fi dongle, and I mean that's working fine. It's just kind of annoying that I bought a component that was literally built for and compatible with this computer, yet because HP didn't deem it so, it doesn't work. And this can be attributed to lots of things and lots of companies. Apple haters will basically blame Apple for the exact same things, in some cases rightly so, but also it's other OEM manufacturers too. But sticking with HP for a second, I've also heard similar horror stories about their rack mount server line also, which is one of the reasons why I've kind of stayed away from HP servers as far as my home lab's concerned, because I've heard, other stories like third-party cards, like just not allowing the system to boot or post. And I think at one point I even heard a story about like non-HP certified RAM or something causing issues, which is absolutely mind-boggling to me. But it also should be said that Dell isn't a whole lot better either, because Dell is also has also done similar things. Now, personally, I don't have as much issue, specifically with the Dell server line. I've had pretty good experience with their servers. I've thrown in aftermarket cards into my Dell servers, and they've worked just fine. The only kind of issue with Dell servers and third-party cards is IPMI and the fan control kind of goes haywire a little bit. But the nice thing about that is, I mean, there's well-documented IPMI commands on how to, and scripts out there on how to control a Dell server's fan control through IPMI commands. So while yes, you don't necessarily get the integrated support with the Dell system, the BIOS able to talk to the firmware on the card to get the temperature readouts and adjust the fan control accordingly, you can easily do that with a script and IPMI commands in order to do that for you. So yeah, it's not as nice and convenient, but at least the system still posts and still works with third-party cards installed. And you can just do some simple IPMI commands in order, and with a script in order to get it working. But there was something else I was going to go on this as well. Oh yeah, there was a time where I swore I would never buy another Dell again. Now, in fairness, I have never bought another new Dell product since this happened. So essentially the story here is, in college, I got a Dell laptop for college, and mind you, this was before I really got into computers and home labbing. Now, I knew at the time that I wanted to do software development as my profession, so I went to school, of course, for computer science, and I knew that was going to be my career path, but I didn't really have as much knowledge about the actual hardware side of things, like computers in general. And I made the mistake of kind of getting a computer that I saw some person recommending in some, like, I think it was some, I don't know if it was like the Facebook group or something. There was some like forum of, kids going to the same school I was going to on like computer recommendations. And I went with one of those, which probably was a mistake. But anyway, the reason why I vowed not to get another Dell again was because that computer was an absolute hunk of junk. I still have it and it still works, but let's just say I'm very happy I got the warranty with it, because in the amount of parts, labor, and shipping costs that went into that computer, Dell essentially paid for a new computer plus some, because on Dell's dime, I had to get the fan replaced twice. I had to get a new motherboard and a new power supply. And I also broke the screen on it, but that was kind of my fault. But at the same time, it was still under warranty, so I got a free replacement on it. So basically, the entire system got replaced. Actually, if you give me 1 second here, I will try to bring it up, because I think I actually wrote down the entire cost for everything that it cost in order for Dell to fix it. So just give me 1 sec here. Okay, so I don't have it like broken down specifically part by part, but the rough total in parts for the system was like $735 just in parts. So that's not including the labor, that's not including the shipping costs, me shipping the computer to Dell and them shipping it back to me. That's just for the costs of the fans, power supply, motherboard, display, all that good stuff. And the funny thing about the power supply instance was, I don't remember, so the first time the fan blew out on it and the fan stopped working, so the device overheated. The second time the fan died and the motherboard died because the HDMI port for some reason stopped working. And when I shipped it to Dell for them to fix, they shipped it back to me, and I don't know if they busted the power supply I sent them, or they just shipped a broken one back. I don't know what happened, but the power supply that came back when they shipped the computer back to me didn't work, so they had to ship another one out. It was horrible. The blessing in disguise here was that Dell was essentially what, as I think DOS Dude 1 said, uh, allowed him to see the light and turn to Macs. Now, I probably, because Linux, I mean, at the end of the day, Linux is fantastic, and I love Linux and use Linux on a daily basis. And honestly, if I had to not use Mac OS as my daily operating system, I'd probably go to Linux. But that, of course, would still use off-the-shelf, essentially PCs as far as your computer goes. But the reason why that Dell kind of switched me on to using a Mac was because that was literally the only way I could do schoolwork for a time, was because a Mac computer was the only computer I had that worked, because this computer was being shipped back and forth to Dell. And at one point, I even essentially put it in timeout and didn't use it at all for like an entire semester plus. And then eventually it just got to the point where I was like, I don't even want to use this thing anymore. It's broken so many times. I'm just going to use my Mac because it's better, faster, and just a better machine. So that's essentially what kind of transitioned me over to using Macs. But anyway, that was a complete tangent. I didn't even plan on telling that story anyway. So let's try to get back on track a little bit with other nerdy things that I actually did this week rather than years ago. So another thing I did was I brought a Linux virtual machine back from the death and essentially was performing open heart surgery on it in a way. So essentially what happened here was, typically when I want to resize a virtual machine, I'll just add additional storage to it and then go through the process of extending the volume and resizing the VM that way. But this time, I realized there was plenty of space still in this VM, it just wasn't allocated properly, and there was a lot more data going to swap than honestly had any right being there, and it didn't need that much swap. So I removed the swap partition, volume, whatever, and that, of course, caused issues, because when I tried to reboot the system, it failed to even boot because it was, of course, trying to look for that swap partition that no longer existed. So there was no way to actually boot into the system, so what I had to do was boot into recovery mode and essentially mount the file system. The dead no longer, well, it still worked, it just wouldn't actually boot into the operating system. So I had to mount the file system that was essentially broken because it was missing a partition, save off all the user data, because of course you don't want to just, go full on and just hope for the best and potentially risk losing all the data. So of course I saved all that off, modified the partitions, recreated the missing one, recopied the data back to make sure everything was still good, and then tried to boot it back up, and bingo bango, we were back up and running. So I essentially kind of had the patient full out on the operating table, of course the patient being the file system, and essentially reconstructing and recreating it in order to get it to work again. So that was a kind of fun story, I guess. But then, of course, the last thing I want to touch on here before we kind of wrap up is the Pokemon updates. And this is where we get into the solved problem that I touched on as part of the Operation Core Dump. So the Pokemon updates this week was, I've talked the past couple weeks about working on the bag interface and kind of how the back end portion of the bag actually integrates with the bag screen. So this time I actually integrated the back end, to be able to actually remember where you were in the bag when you were last in the menu. So if you've ever played a Pokemon game before, when you go into the bag menu and say you're scrolling around through the various pockets and scrolling through the items, if you exit out of the bag menu and go back into it, you'll essentially pick up right where you left off. And then when you go back through each of the previous pockets, it'll remember exactly where you were in that pocket. So that was something that I didn't previously have functioning and working, so I just added that in. It was a pretty trivial feature to add, so got that in and working. working. And then I also overhauled what was the draw interact options function. So previously this function I'd basically feed it a list of strings or options, and then it would automatically draw a text box to fit all of those options, and then have a selection arrow to allow you to scroll through which option you wanted to select or interact with. Now, the issue here was it only would work in the sense that it would always draw the text box for you in a set location. And of course, that wasn't the functionality I wanted to go for, but I also didn't want to write a completely new function. So I essentially refactored and reworked this function to be more universal and essentially allowed the user, aka the developer, aka me, to provide a text box that I wanted it to use, and rather than drawing the default one for me, and it would just use the one that I provided it. So yay for code reusability. That's why we write functions in code, and why we reuse code. One, because you can reuse it like this, and two, it prevents you from having to make multiple changes of the same thing in multiple different places. That's of course also why you use variables, which ironically I had a rather interesting conversation at work for something completely different, where one of the guys I was working with was complaining about a certain user interface, and it was essentially came back to the same instance where variables weren't being set, so you would have to change things in multiple places. Code reusability, it's a fantastic thing. So the other thing that I also got working was the item counter. So of course, one thing that's important to know when you're going through your inventory is to be able to know how many of that specific item you have. So it's mildly important that it's there and it's now in the game. The other thing added was descriptions as well. So it's also kind of nice to know if you see an item you're not familiar with, kind of having the description of what it actually does. So this required a couple different updates. One, I actually had to add descriptions to the item class itself, and two, of course, I had to get that description displaying on the UI. Now, this is so when I was trying to do this, that realization you get when you're troubleshooting a bug, only to realize that the reason for your issue is because you failed to do something quite trivial. So when I was trying to integrate this, the specifically actually integrating the description into the item class, this is, of course, something that should be very trivial to do, right? You literally just create a string, and you set that string equal to whatever the description is, and you're good to go. And because we're using classes, you can do inheritance and overwriting functions and variables to overwrite in each new instance of the item for the essentially the child, or so for instance, you have the parent item class, and then you have children for all the different types of items, whether that's the Pokeball, Great Ball, Rare Candy, Escape Rope, all the various items. Each one of those is a child of the parent item class. So you can just overwrite the description for each child, and you're good to go. So it's a fairly trivial and easy update to make. But of course, I had to make things way more difficult because quite honestly, I forgot to do something that was super trivial and made myself look quite dumb and incompetent as a side effect. So I'm honestly quite familiar with these matters because I do them quite frequently, and as I mentioned, I had another occurrence this week. So essentially what the issue ended up being was when I was updating the children classes of the item class, I wasn't actually setting the copy constructor and equals operator correctly. So quite the derp moment there. Because, of course, there's this thing in C++ called the rule of three or the rule of five. Essentially, when you're creating classes, it's how you construct and destruct objects, essentially. So specifically the rule of three here is you have to have your constructor, which builds the object, and then it's the copy constructor. So when you're passing the object through functions or things like that, you're appropriately assigning the new values, and then of course the destructor to free things. And the issue was I wasn't setting the copy constructor, so when the object was kind of getting copied around and moved, the description that I was setting wasn't actually being saved anywhere and moved along, and it was a very embarrassing mistake, if we're being quite honest. And I'm not even going to tell you how long it took me to realize said mistake, but needless to say, this is where I fell victim and uttered the second most infamous words any software developer can utter when I started working on this description thing, and that, of course, was, "Let me implement this feature real quick." Because as we've kind of touched on, this should have been something super trivial that I should have easily been able to knock out in maybe 5 minutes tops. And of course, it ended up taking significantly longer than that. So I did not implement that feature real quick, and I, of course, ended up eating my words and just proved once again why those words of "let me implement this feature real quick" are so infamous. So, in addition to that, when I was implementing the description, so once I got all of that embarrassing flubbingness out of the way of forgetting how to write code, apparently, I then realized I came to another problem of how do I display this text properly, because there is a small text box for the description on the screen, so I needed to figure out a way in order to properly display that text and, take into account, the bounds of the text field and make sure that do I want to add new lines into the description? Do I want to do some dynamic thing to account for the text barrier and do some kind of word wrapping thing? Because remember, this game is being coded from scratch. There is no game engine, there is no JText fields or anything like that auto do, word wrapping and things like that for you. None of that exists. So if I want that functionality, I have to write it myself or find someone else that had already done the code and I can, essentially import it into the project. So as I was trying to think about how I wanted to solve this issue, I remembered something. This is a solved problem. And when I say a solved problem, I use this both in this Pokemon game as well as, in my professional life as a software developer. I refer to things as solved problems. And essentially what I mean by that is it's something that I have already previously solved before, whether that is I wrote a program that already does that thing, I wrote a function that already handles that use case, or something to that effect that I've already encountered this problem before and have already created a solution for it. So there's no sense in me writing another function to already do the thing that the function I already wrote does, if that makes sense. So I came to this realization that this was a solved problem because way back in the day, in the beginnings of this endeavor, when I was first implementing the graphics portion of the game, I did this exact case, right? I was trying to essentially create a demo of, the character moving around the screen and kind of going in and out of buildings and interacting with, things in the environment and things like that. Now, I haven't touched that portion of the code in, I think we're probably at least 2 years at this point, probably maybe even closer to 2.5. It's been a while. So I kind of forgot that some of that code existed. And if you'll excuse me for forgetting, the code base at this point, I actually haven't ran a check with my source code line calculator. But the last time I checked, which in fairness was a few months ago, it was over, I think, 17,000 lines of code, and I've written a decent amount more since then. So we're probably creeping up close to 20,000, if not maybe, plus or minus, maybe a 1,000 or 2 lines of code. Regardless, the code base is getting to be fairly large at this point, at least for my standards anyway, since up until this project specifically, I think the largest code base I had ever worked on personally, like for a personal project, was around like 6,000 to 7,000 lines of code, and some of that code was essentially me importing other projects to kind of link into this one project. Since it was just basically a Java application and I was essentially linking other Java-like applications I already had, all to essentially work within one kind of one app, if you will. But this project has by far been the largest software development endeavor that I've ever gone down. So forgive me if I forgot about a function that I wrote essentially 2.5 years ago that already solved this problem for me. But essentially, when I was writing that demo code for, kind of the user walking around the environment and interacting with things, one of the things that I tried to fix or solve was when you would talk to a sign or something to read what was on the sign, it would, pop up a text box and display the text within the text box. And one of the problems I had to solve was, okay, how do I determine how many words to write in a line before going to a new line? Do I write a new line, in the string itself so it'll automatically do it and kind of split based on that? How do I accomplish this? And I think if I'm remembering correctly, I ended up finding a solution. I think it was from one of the Raylib examples actually, where they essentially kind of solved this problem already also. So I essentially kind of copied that code, pasted it in, and of course I didn't just copy paste and call it a day. There were some slight tweaks and modifications that I made to fit my use case, and of course within the source code itself there is a reference to the actual link for where I got the code from, so I'm not stealing the code and claiming it's mine. I do have the reference in there, but this is what I'm referring to and talking about when I say it's a solved problem. Now, as part of this solved problem, I then realized that one of the issues with this original implementation was it didn't have the shadow text effect that I've been trying to implement throughout the program wherever there's text being displayed. And essentially what this shadow text effect is if you played Pokemon Emerald, for instance, one thing you'll kind of notice is you have like the letters and then there's kind of a shadow or kind of a background to the letters. It's kind of hard to describe, but essentially if you have like a black text like kind of behind and slightly down on the letter, there'll be kind of like a grayer color to kind of let the black text like kind of pop more. So that's kind of one thing that I've been trying to implement, and this original function didn't have that. So I tried to, get that integrated and working to have the shadow effect, and then I realized I essentially had multiple functions more or less doing the same thing, all, applying this shadow text effect. So I kind of went through and refactored the code base a little bit to kind of alleviate some of that. I didn't necessarily completely remove those functions because that would break a lot of things because I'm calling it in a lot of places, but rather I kind of modified some of the input variables and essentially called, if you call this function, it's essentially just calling another function. I might eventually kind of go back through that and either fix that even further or just straight up remove those, essentially duplicate functions, if you will, that are just calling other ones. I might go back, do that later, but I was just happy to get it working because when when I went on this crusade to do that and kind of tweaked some of the input parameters, it caused around like 20 compiler errors or so. So that was some tweaking and fixing that I had to go back in and fix. But that's nothing, a controller command shift F, to find all and replace can't fix for you. Because again, at the end of the day, it was fairly trivial since I think I only ended up removing one of the parameters. So I could essentially kind of search through all of the instances where that function existed, find that one parameter, and just remove it. So it was pretty quick to actually get removed and updated and fixed. But of course, it is always kind of a little overwhelming when your code is working and compiling fine. You change one minor thing, and then out of nowhere, you get like 20 plus compiler errors, and your program doesn't work. So, going back through and fixing all that is always a fun time, if you will. But at the end of the day, it's always, very refreshing when you go through a refactor like that, or you rediscover or use a function that you already exist to kind of solve a complex problem that you were kind of, thinking and scratching your head of, okay, how do I go about solving this? This is probably going to, take, maybe a couple hours in order to figure out. And then you realize, oh, hey, I already solved this issue before. I already have a function that does that. And then you can just implement it. So whenever something like that happens, or, I do a big refactor like that and everything gets working again, it's always such, a good and refreshing feeling in order to know and to see that happen. So I think that's kind of going to about do it for this episode. But before we go, we of course have to get back to our trivia question for the week. So this week's trivia question is, what programming language is older, Python or Java? And again, bonus points if you can get the year for each of those languages. So if you said Java, unfortunately, you are incorrect. And maybe my hint that I gave at the very beginning of the episode of the one you're thinking of is probably wrong. If that helped you and you said Python, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And to be honest with you, before I researched and found the answer to this, I would have said Java too. I'm just being completely honest with you. Because when we think Python, we kind of think, new, more modern language. But no, in reality, the original version of Python, so not the new Python 3. What are they up to? The 13, I think, wasn't that, of course. The original Python, Python 1, I believe, or Python in general, when Python was first released, whatever version that ended up being, whether it's 1.0 or 0. something, whatever it was released in 1991. So Python came out in 1991. I didn't realize it had been out that long. And then Java didn't come out until 1995. So, yeah. Python older than Java. So congratulations if you got that trivia question correct. And if you got it through my hint, also congratulations to you as well. There was probably someone out there that was second guessing themselves when I gave that hint because they knew the answer was Python. And then when I said you're probably wrong, they were like, oh shoot, is it actually Java? So then they switched their answer. And if you were one of those people, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I tripped you up. Maybe I should just stop giving hints. I don't know. But then the people that were helped by the hint will probably be like, no, keep giving the hints because it actually helps me get these trivia questions correct. But anyway, that's going to do it for me in this episode. If you enjoyed, definitely be sure to leave a rating and review and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also, be sure to share with a friend or family member. We touched on a lot of good stuff this week, specifically with the use after free stuff and that Firefox 0 day, and kind of some of the lessons from, solved problems and code reusability. So definitely be sure to share it around. And if you have any questions about this week's episode or you have any topics or ideas for future episodes, definitely shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. Or if you're on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.